Hey everyone, I wanted to put together a little demonstration on how to do the standard deviation for grouped data. So when you are not given all of the individual pieces of information, but you still have to find that standard deviation in order to understand or be able to analyze what you're looking at. So I'm using this example here that really is a range. It tells me that there's two people that have blood pressure between 106 and 115. Because I don't know what their exact blood pressure is, we're going to use the midpoint. So what I've done with this data, in order just to be able to streamline and do some things a little bit quicker, is I've separated the 106 to 115 into two cells, all the way down so you can see the ranges, 106 to 115, 116 to 125. Now what I'm going to put over here is a column that is the midpoint. And all I'm doing is finding the average of the two endpoints that is there, then clicking and dragging. So here's the midpoints of all that data. So what it means is I don't know exactly where these two people are, but I know that the midpoint's 110. So I'm going to approximate that these two people have a combined blood pressure of 220.1 or 221 actually. So really what I'm going to be doing is this formula down here. It's the standard deviation formula. You'll notice that you have the x minus x bar, x minus average squared. We've got the square root of that divided by the sum of f. In this case is how many total people. I'm not looking at just 10 people. I'm looking at whatever this sum is. So total, and I'm going to put that, I'm actually going to move these over so I'm not underneath that. The total number of people I have here in column F is 85. All right, so I have 85 total people that I'm working with. So let's go ahead and do this formula. And I'm going to start by first of all finding the average. But in order to find the average of all 85 people, I have to do F times the midpoint. There's 2 at 110. So in each one of these cases, I'm taking the frequency times the midpoint, and I'm going to bring all of those down. All right, so now I have all of these. In order to find this weighted average, though, I am going to have to take the sum of all of these things divided by really the sum of F. But since I have it right here, I'll throw it in there and say, here is my average. So my average for all of this is going to be 153. Now remember, when you're looking at the standard deviation, you have to take each individual thing minus that average. So I'm going to do this part right here, the x minus average. I'll put it in parentheses. And there are ways to simplify and do this in a little bit fewer steps, but to break it all down, x minus the average. The midpoint is my x. I've got two things at 110.5. All right, so this minus. Now I could type in this average. I'm going to click on it and use the function for button. You'll notice that it cycles through putting these dollar signs on here. Those dollar signs lock this into place. So it's always going to subtract that average. I could also just type in the 153.55. But I'm going to lock that into place and drag that down. And now it's subtracted the midpoint minus the average for every single one of these midpoints. All right, now that I have the x minus the average, I need to square each of these things. I forgot to do that in here, so I'm going to go back into this top formula, and you'll notice I did g squared, or g2 minus this. I'm going to put a square on it right away. So now it took that, subtracted it, squared it. The next thing I have to do is multiply each of those things times f. So here's f times this last thing squared that I just did. So in this case, 2 times this. Drag that all the way down. I've got all of those. The last step then, or last two steps, I need the sum of all of this that I just did. So equals the sum of j. And I need to divide that by the sum of how many things I have, the frequency. Remember, I have 85. So I am really going to do, if I want to do this in fewer steps, I would do equals the sum of j divided by the sum of f. That gives me 480.05. That's everything that's underneath the square root. Again, I could just take the square root of this and get 21. I personally like to do that all at once. So I like to take the square root of the sum of j divided by the sum of f. Close that thing up. You'll notice I have it all in one step. So how many things you want to put together really just depends on how much you want to depend on parentheses. But that is the way that we use the frequency distribution and the standard deviation formula in order to come up with a standard deviation for this group of 21.9.